She expected to be branded like cattle. Instead, they tipped their hats. The sun beat down on the Texas dust where barbed wire carved a border into the flat earth. A convoy pulled up beside the POW camp, its cargo quiet, exhausted. Japanese women prisoners, fresh off a train from California. Their hands trembled, eyes cast low. One woman, still in a tattered nurse's uniform, braced herself for American punishment, degradation, maybe worse. Instead, the first sound she heard was a slow-spoken voice, low and unmistakably Southern. "Ma'am, that hat of yours don't match those boots." The soldier who said it wasn't sneering. He was smiling. Another leaned against the fence and said, just loud enough to be heard, "She ain't no captive to me." The words cut deeper than cruelty ever could, not because they were kind, but because they made no sense. And what happened next would unravel everything these women had ever believed about enemies, honor, and themselves. The train hissed as it came to a stop, brakes screaming like wounded animals against the sun-bleached rails. The air was dry, thick with dust and heat, and the wind carried the smell of cattle, tobacco, and something else, burnt mesquite wood. A wooden sign creaked on rusted hinges above the station platform. Camp Cottonwood. The name sounded harmless, almost sweet. But for the Japanese women inside the rail cars, it was just another unknown in a world already turned inside out. They had crossed half a continent by now, California to Arizona, Arizona to Texas, and each mile had deepened their dread. The doors slid open. Guards shouted brief orders, but not in the way they'd expected. No barking, no kicks, no rifles raised to rush them out. Instead, the men stood under the blazing sky with the relaxed posture of cowboys on break. Their uniforms were khaki, yes, but some wore wide-brimmed hats, some chewed on toothpicks, and a few leaned against fences like this was a picnic, not a prison. One even had a guitar slung over his back. The women stepped down one by one, some squinting into the sun, others shielding their faces. One young nurse, no older than 20, felt the heat sting her skin and tried to adjust the makeshift cap on her head. Her fingers were trembling. She hadn't eaten since sunrise. Her coat stuck to her back with sweat and fear. She expected to be shoved, mocked, maybe worse. Instead, one of the American guards, boots dusty, hat tilted low, walked up and held out a hand to steady her. "Careful there, ma'am," he drawled, and tipped his hat. She froze. She wasn't sure what startled her more, the gesture itself or the word. Ma'am. Was it sarcasm? A cruel joke? But his face was unreadable, shaded by the brim. He didn't leer. He didn't sneer. He just turned and walked away, boots crunching softly against the dirt. Around her the other women exchanged glances. No one dared speak, but the silence buzzed louder than any scream. This wasn't what they'd been told. In training camps back in Japan, they had heard of American barbarity, soldiers who shot prisoners for sport, who fed women to dogs, who humiliated their captives with gleeful cruelty. But now, here, the guards stood with their thumbs hooked in their belts, chatting casually, nodding politely. They looked like something from a moving picture, not an occupying force. A few of the women were marched toward the entrance gates, their boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The fence was barbed wire, yes, and tall, but it wasn't ringed with shouting or violence. Just two cowboys, soldiers really, but they looked too calm for that, standing beside the open gate. And then it happened again. As the group approached, one of the guards stepped forward, grabbed the iron gate, and pulled it open wide. With a grin and a slow drawl, he gestured them through and said, "Ladies first." No one moved, not out of disobedience, but because their legs had gone, numb from disbelief. The nurse was the first to step through. She glanced at the soldier. He nodded, almost solemnly, like someone seeing off a church congregation. It was maddening, this quiet dignity. Terrifying, even, because it made no sense. If they had been spat on, they could have borne it. If they had been cursed, it would have fit the story. But to be treated like people? She kept walking, clutching her duffel bag so tightly her knuckles whitened. Inside were a few scraps of cloth, a single photograph, and a letter she hadn't dared read again since California. Behind her, someone whispered in Japanese, "What is this place?" No one had the answer. The women were shown to the barracks, long wooden buildings painted white, with small porches and open windows. The paint was chipped. The roofs were tin. But they were real buildings, not tents. Inside, the air was cooler. Each bunk had a thin mattress, a wool blanket folded with military precision, and a pillow that smelled faintly of detergent. One woman, older, sat on the edge of her bed and ran her hand over the blanket like she didn't believe it was real. Outside, the guards chatted among themselves about cattle drives and barbecue sauce. One played a harmonica. And when the dinner bell rang, an actual brass bell mounted to a post, it sounded more like the call to a town hall meeting than a prison meal. The nurse sat on her bunk, staring at her own hands. She could still feel the echo of that voice. "Ma'am." She had never been called that in her life, not even in Japan, not by officers, not by her brothers, and certainly not by a man with a gun. The word had nestled into her like a thorn wrapped in silk, soft in delivery, sharp in implication. "Ma'am." What did it mean to be shown dignity by the very enemy she had been trained to despise? As she sat on the edge of the bunk, hands folded around the corner of the wool blanket, her mind drifted backward, thousands of miles and countless fears away, to where the war had first stitched shame into her bones. In Japan, they did not prepare women for survival. They prepared them for sacrifice. At training camps outside Tokyo, young women wore khaki skirts and armbands, recited morning oaths, and bowed to portraits of the emperor. Their instructors spoke in clipped voices about duty, purity, and the sacredness of death. The code of Bushido wasn't just for soldiers. It seeped into their skin, too. Better to die than be taken, they were told. Not as metaphor, as law. One instructor once whispered to her group, "If your camp is overrun, use your belt." The implication was clear. Hang yourself, and if you couldn't, bite your tongue, drown yourself, or find something sharp. For years, these girls had absorbed stories of nurses who burned alive in their posts rather than surrender, of signal operators who leapt from cliffs to keep secrets safe. These were held up as examples of honor. And somewhere along the way, the line between courage and annihilation blurred. So when surrender came, it didn't feel like mercy. It felt like erasure. The nurse remembered the moment they laid down their weapons. She hadn't held a rifle. She wasn't even allowed one. But when her commanding officer, bloodied and trembling, ordered everyone to destroy all paperwork and burn the rising sun flag stitched to their sleeves, it felt like she was dissolving. She did what she was told. She watched the fabric curl and blacken in the fire. She buried her medical notes, and then, with the last shred of defiance she had left, she stuffed a photograph of her mother inside her blouse and pressed it to her chest. If she died, she wanted that image to be found with her. But no death came, only waiting. The enemy didn't storm in with bayonets. They sent jeeps and translators. When American soldiers appeared, uniforms dusty and eyes wary, they didn't fire. They offered water. The moment of surrender was quiet. Too quiet. It was the absence of violence that made it unbearable. The women were ordered onto trucks, then trains. Some wept. Others sat in stone silence, arms wrapped around knees. One clutched a razor blade in her palm the entire journey, but never found the courage to use it. There were no final speeches, no tearful goodbyes. Just the rattling of wheels over track, the smell of oil and old wood, and the constant hum of disbelief. Were they still soldiers? Prisoners? Traitors? She remembered one woman, older, maybe 30, who whispered, "Our families will disown us." Another replied, "If they think we're alive at all." That silence carried through every mile. They shared food in hushed bites, passed canteens without speaking. Some stared at the ceiling of the rail car, eyes glazed over with shame. Hidden in her sleeve, the nurse had tucked a letter she had never dared to send. It was short, only a few lines. "Mother, I failed. I survived." It was written in pencil, the strokes faint and smudged from the sweat of her arm. She didn't know if she would burn it or eat it or bury it, but she kept it, because she needed some piece of the truth to carry with her, even if no one else would ever see it. By the time the train slowed in Texas, her soul felt lighter than her suitcase, and not in a good way. It was as if her identity had been stripped and folded into the very bundle of clothes and keepsakes she clutched to her chest. She had packed her shame with her, folded it beside the bandages, the ration tin, and the last clean handkerchief she owned. Now, in this strange place with sun-cracked earth and soft-spoken enemies, that suitcase sat at the foot of her bunk like a quiet accusation. She had survived. That much was undeniable. But in the world she came from, survival came at the cost of everything else. The dinner bell rang before sunset. It was not a harsh clanging, but a single peal, long and clear, like a call to supper in a forgotten country town. The women moved in slow silence toward the mess hall, their shadows stretching across the dust-packed yard like question marks. Inside the building, long tables had already been set. Metal trays waited at the serving counter. Steam curled from pots. The scent hit them first. Bacon, unmistakably rich, joined by the warm starch of potatoes and something foreign but strangely comforting. Cornbread. The nurse stepped forward, tray in hand, and watched as a man in a white apron, his sleeves rolled up, forearms darkened by sun, placed a generous scoop of scrambled eggs beside the meat. He didn't look at her with pity or disgust, just nodded and moved to the next plate. She took her seat on the bench, head bowed, her fingers trembling. Around her, the women sat in stunned silence, as if trying to decode the food in front of them. She lifted the fork to her mouth and paused. One breath, two. Then she tasted it. The salt hit first, then the richness of yolk. It flooded her mouth like memory, except this was not memory. This was entirely foreign. Her stomach clenched in protest, not from sickness, but from disbelief. She had eaten moldy rice, chewed sawdust-thick barley, and licked condensation from tent walls. Now, this. A woman across the table dropped her fork. Another wept silently into her coffee. One younger girl stuffed cornbread into her sleeve just in case, but the nurse ate, slowly, deliberately, as though this might all be snatched away. Every bite was a betrayal of the hunger she had accepted as sacred. Later that night, after they had returned to the barracks and laid down beneath wool blankets that actually held warmth, she listened. The room was quiet. Too quiet. No shouted orders, no distant artillery, just breathing, soft and uncertain, like a room of children pretending to sleep. Then came the sound. A slow, mournful tune hummed into the night from somewhere beyond the fence. A harmonica. Notes drawn out long and low, like the kind you'd imagine drifting from a back porch or a field of wheat. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't cruel. It was human, and that made it unbearable. The nurse sat up slightly, her back against the barrack wall, blanket pulled to her chin. She didn't know the song, but it found a place in her chest that hurt to be touched. It reminded her of something she couldn't name. Not home, not peace, just before. The tune wandered through the night for a few minutes, then faded. No one spoke, but she knew the others heard it too. A woman beside her shifted under the covers and whispered a single word, too soft to translate, and then silence again. It was worse than cruelty, this, because cruelty could be resisted, pain could be met with defiance. But this softness, this warmth, it eroded her defenses. Each act of gentleness scraped away the armor she had, built to survive. How could she hate a place that gave her stew? How could she despise a guard who called her ma'am and opened doors? It was emotional whiplash. She had prepared for fists, not forks, for boots in her back, not blankets around her shoulders. Her body responded without permission, eating, resting, accepting, but her mind thrashed like an animal in a trap. Kindness felt like a trick. She looked at the ceiling above her cot, tracing the wooden planks with her eyes, and tried to summon hatred. But the stew had been hot, the eggs had been soft, the music had been beautiful, and she didn't know what to do with that. The morning after the harmonica lullaby, a new announcement echoed across the compound. An interpreter, awkward in his phrasing but careful with his tone, delivered the news with quiet formality. "You may write letters home." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible, undeniable, but impossible to grasp. For a moment, no one moved. The women sat on their bunks, staring at one another, trying to decide whether this was kindness or a trap. In their world, correspondence from captivity wasn't just rare, it was unthinkable. A few hours later, sheets of thin paper were handed out, along with dull pencils. No threats, no pre-written templates, just blank space. And that, somehow, was worse. The nurse sat with the paper in her lap, her hands still smelling faintly of soap from her morning wash. Around her, others scribbled in cautious strokes, some pausing to erase and rewrite the same line again and again. She stared at her own page for what felt like hours. What could she possibly say? "Dear Mother, I am not dead. They gave me stew and called me Miss." That was the truth, but it also felt like a betrayal, not just of her country or of the code she had been raised to follow, but of the shared suffering of every Japanese woman who hadn't been captured. Her mother had likely buried her in her heart already, lighting incense before a photograph, whispering prayers for a soul presumed lost to honor. And now this, a pencil, a sheet of paper, and the warm, ridiculous memory of scrambled eggs. She began writing anyway. "I am alive. I am not harmed. They feed us well. We sleep in beds. It is strange. I do not understand it." No flourishes, no sentiment, just fact. She folded the paper carefully and handed it to the guard when asked. He didn't read it. He simply nodded and placed it in a canvas bag with the others. What the women didn't know was that most of these letters would never reach their destinations. Japanese intelligence would intercept many of them, and when those intercepted messages landed on desks in Tokyo and Osaka, in military bunkers and government offices, they caused quiet storms. The content wasn't treasonous, it was worse, it was ordinary. Statements of warmth, of nourishment, of simple kindness. Letters that read, "The guards are polite," or "They let us work in gardens," or "We are allowed to learn English if we wish." These messages didn't break security. They broke narrative. The very idea that American camps could offer dignity to Japanese women contradicted years of state propaganda. To believe these letters would be to question everything the Empire had promised. Some officers dismissed them as forgeries, others demanded investigations. One intercepted note, written by a girl barely 19, read, "I have not been punished. I have not been touched. They gave me medicine when I was ill." That sentence alone was enough to send alarm through a dozen intelligence corridors. Back in Sioux, Texas, the women didn't know their words had become weapons. They only knew that, for the first time in months, maybe years, they were allowed to speak without being told what to say. A pencil had become more than graphite and wood. It was a lifeline, a rebellion, a confession. One woman began writing in secret after lights out, pages folded into her underclothes. She wasn't writing to send. She was writing to survive. Another carved her name into the wooden bed frame, letter by letter, as if grounding herself in the fact that she still existed. The nurse, meanwhile, wrote again, and again, pages she would never mail, thoughts she could not say aloud. Not all of them wrote with hope. Some wrote with guilt, some with numb practicality. But even the act of writing, of holding a pencil not as a tool of record but as a vessel of self, was a kind of quiet resurrection. For women trained to be functionaries of empire, told that their pain was duty and their silence was virtue, finding a voice inside the fences was perhaps the most dangerous freedom of all. The next morning they were told to prepare for delousing. The word itself was clinical, stripped of emotion, but to the women it was loaded with dread. They had heard stories. In occupied territories, in whispered rumors passed between prisoners of other wars, delousing was not about cleanliness. It was about humiliation, stripping, exposure, shame. They stood in line outside a low white building, the sun pressing down like a silent threat, clutching their uniforms and towels as if they were shields. No one spoke. Even the guards were quiet. Not cruel, just matter of fact, as though this were another errand on a long to-do list. Inside, the air changed. It was warm, humid. The hiss of steam pipes and dripping water filled the tiled room. One by one they were led to stalls. No gawking eyes, no forced stripping. Just space, a wooden bench, a bar of soap, and a curt gesture toward the showers. The nurse hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the rough towel. She stepped in slowly, almost waiting for someone to bark a command, to tear the curtain open, to turn kindness into mockery. But no one came. She stood alone in the tiled cubicle, facing a wall, and turned the knob. Hot water poured over her like a sentence she hadn't expected. It ran down her back in rivulets, tracing every bruise, every scar, every memory she'd tried to forget. The steam rose like a veil, and in that moment it happened. Not rage, not relief, but grief. Quiet, sharp, and strange. The soap slipped once in her hand. She gripped it tightly as if it might float away and take her with it. She washed her hair slowly, feeling strands loosen, lice fall away, skin soften, and with every motion she realized something unbearable. She was being restored, not punished, not purged, but cleaned, and it felt like too much, because if this basic human ritual could exist inside a prison, what had her freedom really been? When she stepped out, wrapped in a dry towel that smelled faintly of bleach and cotton, her knees buckled slightly, not from weakness, from confusion. She caught her reflection in a cracked mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she was cleaner, but because she looked cared for. Around her, the others moved quietly. Some sat on benches, brushing out their hair with fingers. One woman stared at the soap in her hand long after the water had stopped, holding it like a relic. Another wept silently as she pulled on clean underclothes, the cotton soft against skin that had known only rough fabric and sweat for weeks. There were no guards shouting, no boots pacing the tile, only the rhythmic dripping of water and the soft rustle of cloth. Later, back in the barracks, the nurse folded her old uniform and placed it at the foot of her bed. It was stiff, stained with earth and salt. It smelled of fear. Her new clothes didn't fit perfectly, but they were clean. And somehow that felt more dangerous than the barbed wire outside, because she wasn't supposed to feel comfort here. And yet, as she sat on her bunk, combing the tangles from her hair, the question came to her uninvited, like a breeze sneaking under the door. If this is prison, what was freedom? The Empire had given her glory, yes, but only in abstract. Slogans, songs, marches. It had never given her warmth, never given her soap, never made her feel human. That night, the smell of shampoo clung to her skin as she lay in bed. The blanket was heavy on her chest. Her body felt like it belonged to her again, and that was a revelation she didn't know how to hold. The silence in the room was complete, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with thought, with memory, with the slow, aching understanding that the life they had left behind might not have been life at all. The next afternoon, when the sun sat high enough to bleach the yard in bright white heat, the guards gathered a small group of women near the fence line. There was no urgency in their voices, no weapons held in threatening angles, just a nod toward the open field beside the barracks and a wooden crate placed at the center of the dust. Inside the crate lay packets of seeds, their labels printed with bright pictures of vegetables none of the women had seen in months. Tomatoes, beans, squash, colors they had forgotten existed. The order, when it came, was simple. They were to plant a garden, not forced, but offered. The interpreter made the meaning clear. If you wish, you may grow something. Grow something. The words landed on the nurse like a stone dropped into a still pool. She stood with her arms crossed, the hot wind tugging at her sleeves, staring at the soil as if waiting for it to open and reveal an answer. Growing meant time. Growing meant future. Growing meant acceptance. And she didn't know if she was allowed to accept anything here, not after everything she had lost, everything she had been told. Yet when one of the guards handed her a small packet of seeds, she didn't refuse. The paper crinkled softly in her hand. Inside, tiny specks of life, light, fragile, absurd, shifted with each breath. She walked toward a strip of earth marked with wooden stakes, kneeled down, and let her fingers sink into the soil. The earth was warm, real. It clung to her skin, filled the small crescents beneath her fingernails, and smelled of sun and roots and something older than war. She dug a shallow trench with her hands, dropped a single seed into the hollow, and covered it gently. Her throat tightened. She didn't know why. Nearby, another woman planted quickly, almost angrily, shoving seeds into the ground, as if trying to bury her own thoughts beneath them. Others refused outright. One woman threw her packet onto the ground, stomping on it until the paper dissolved into dust. Another sat in the shade and crossed her arms, muttering that she would not tend the enemy's garden, would not feed their soil with her labor. Resistance took many forms. Some glared at the guards, some glared at the ground, some glared at the women who dared to kneel. The symbolism was too sharp, too heavy, an unexpected weight pressing on hearts already bruised. But the nurse kept going. She planted a second seed, then a third. With each motion, she felt something shift. Not comfort, not acceptance, but a strange ache that lived halfway between grief and hope. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping her dirty hands against her thighs. The wind lifted the hair at her temples. Sweat trickled down her neck. But for the first time since her capture, she felt anchored. Not safe, not free, but present. As days passed, the garden became its own silent conversation. Some plots remained untouched, dry, defiant. Others thrived, watered in secret by women who pretended not to care. The nurse visited her patch every morning, crouching low to trace the soil with cautious fingertips. When the first green shoot broke through, thin, trembling, almost translucent, she nearly gasped. A sprout, alive. Here, she touched it with the gentleness reserved for wounds and memories. It was nothing more than a leaf, a fragile thread of life pushing upward. But in a place built for containment, the sight of something breaking through the earth felt like a rebellion, life sprouting in captivity. It was a metaphor too painful to ignore. For the women, for their identities, for the beliefs that had cracked beneath the weight of unexpected kindness. The garden was no longer about vegetables or rations. It was a mirror, a quiet assertion that something inside them still existed, something tender, stubborn, unwilling to die. The nurse lingered by her row as the sun dipped low, the sky turning gold behind the fences. She stared at the tiny leaf and felt, for the briefest moment, a tremor of something she hadn't dared imagine since the war began. Possibility. It started with chalk on a blackboard. The word written was freedom. The mess hall had been rearranged that morning, its long wooden tables pushed back to make space for chairs. A makeshift classroom, improvised out of routine and boredom. An American woman, volunteer, civilian, older, with silver hair braided tight, stood beside the board with a stack of dog-eared textbooks in her arms. She smiled gently, but the room was still. The prisoners looked at one another, unsure if this was a test, a performance, or something worse. Freedom. That was the first word she chose to teach. To the women seated in rows, it landed with the weight of irony. The nurse tilted her head slightly, reading the curves of the unfamiliar letters. Freedom? In a place of gates, of fences, of daily roll calls and assigned meals? The word stung, not because it was foreign, but because it wasn't. The nurse raised her hand when asked to pronounce it. Her voice faltered. Free-dom. The syllables felt unnatural in her mouth, thick with the weight of history. The other women followed. Each attempt was hesitant, some choked with laughter, others with bitterness. One muttered under her breath in Japanese, "Do they think this is kindness or cruelty?" No one answered. The lesson moved on to greetings. "Howdy," the volunteer said, smiling. "Howdy, ma'am." She waved a little as she said it, and the room let out a confused chuckle. "It's polite here," she explained. "We say ma'am even to strangers. It's our way." That night, the nurse dreamed of a man tipping his hat and saying, "Howdy, ma'am," as though she were someone who mattered. She woke before sunrise, heart racing, ashamed of her own mind for letting that sound echo in her sleep. But the English seeped in like water into cracked stone. Slowly, relentlessly, labels on crates, chalk on boards, instructions whispered by bilingual guards. Words she once feared now stood like curious animals just outside the perimeter of her understanding. And it wasn't just the words. It was the books. Small paperbacks passed around like contraband, some with illustrations, others with stories. Stories that didn't end in glorious death or sacrificial loyalty, but in quiet survival, second chances, laughter. The nurse found one left behind on a bench, a children's book, simple language, bright drawings. She read it 3 times. The 4th time, she didn't need to sound out the words. Then came the music again, This time from inside the camp. Someone had left a gramophone near the vegetable garden, and when the crank was turned, soft jazz drifted through the afternoon air. Louis Armstrong, perhaps. The notes curled around the corn stalks like smoke, and the women listened with a stillness that felt like reverence. This wasn't a classroom, it was a kind of unraveling. The old stories of duty, shame, obedience began to dull, not disappear, but soften, fray at the edges. The nurse caught herself responding to a guard with, "Thank you." In English, a reflex, a betrayal. And still, she kept learning. Each word was a quiet act of rebellion, not against her country, but against the silence it had demanded of her. Language became more than communication. It became agency, a way to ask, to understand, to refuse. One afternoon, the volunteer handed the nurse a small notebook, blank pages. "Write anything," she said. "In English or not, just write." And so she did. She didn't know it yet, but that little book would become her lifeline. A place where the words freedom, garden, and soap all lived side by side, not as propaganda, but as evidence. Evidence that something had changed. That evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the mesquite trees and the heat of the day had sunk into the earth, a strange sound drifted across the compound. Faint at first, like a memory trying to come back to life, then clearer. Laughter, footsteps, the scrape of chairs, the unmistakable twang of a fiddle tuning its strings. The women in the barracks looked up from their bunks. Some frowned, others stilled. The nurse froze mid-sentence in her notebook, pencil hovering in the air. Music. Again. But this time not a solitary harmonica in the night. This was lively, layered, pulsing with energy. It sounded like a dance. Curiosity tugged at her feet before she could stop it. She slid from her bunk and padded softly toward the window. Outside, lanterns glowed around the soldiers' recreation yard, pale yellow circles illuminating a loose wooden platform that had been laid across the dirt. A handful of cowboys, still soldiers, but softened by the dusk, stood in their hats and boots, tuning instruments and stamping their heels. Others shuffled into a loose crowd, some with hands in pockets, others laughing easily. The fence stood between them, tall, barbed, a line that had defined her world since arrival, but tonight it seemed thinner. The nurse stepped outside, careful not to draw too much attention. A few other women slipped out too, each pretending they were just stepping into the night air, but all of them were there for the same reason. The music. She walked slowly toward the fence until she could feel its cold metal against her skin. The lanterns threw long shadows across the dust, stretching lines of light and dark so the entire compound looked like some strange stage. The soldiers began to play, fiddle, guitar, a tinny harmonica dancing above the melody. It wasn't classical music, it wasn't military music, it was a Texas hoedown, joyous, rhythmic, impossibly alive. Her chest tightened. She shouldn't be here, she shouldn't be listening, she shouldn't want to listen. But her feet refused to move. Across the compound, one cowboy turned in her direction. He wasn't remarkable, young, gangly, hat tipped back on his head, but something in his posture changed when he saw her. Not mocking, not surprised, just acknowledging. He lifted his chin in a small nod, as though greeting a neighbor across a fence, not a prisoner behind wire. The nod hit her like a blow. Because what was it? Kindness? Insult? Betrayal of the distance she needed to feel? Or worse, did it make her a traitor to accept it? Her fingers curled around the top wire of the fence. It was cold, slightly rough, humming faintly with the echoes of distant footfalls. She didn't grasp it tightly, just rested her hand there, the way someone might place their palm on a door they aren't ready to open. The cowboy saw the gesture. His eyes softened almost imperceptibly, and he nodded again, as if to say, "I see you. Not the uniform, not the enemy. You." That was the moment her world cracked, because the fence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a question, a thin line separating not just nations but beliefs, identities, stories she had been raised on. She thought of the word she had learned earlier, freedom. She whispered it now, under her breath, tasting it as though it were forbidden fruit. Behind her, a few women murmured nervously. One tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Don't let them see you." But the nurse couldn't look away. She stood with her hand on the fence until the music shifted into a softer tune. The fiddler drew out a slow, sweet melody that wound through the warm night, like a lullaby meant for no one and everyone. And for the first time since the war began, she felt not safe, not free, but undeniably human. If you're still with us and this moment moved you, tap the like button and tell us in the comments below where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep stories like this alive. Then the news came, folded neatly into a courier's envelope, hand-delivered to the camp's interpreter, and posted like a notice about rations or chores. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The room didn't explode. It didn't erupt in tears or joy or rage. It simply paused. The nurse stared at the words on the bulletin board. Her hands didn't move. Her breath didn't catch. Instead, she felt hollow, like the end of the war had arrived too late to matter. The empire she had given her loyalty to, blindly, fully, had collapsed without her. In her absence, cities had turned to ash, families scattered, whole histories rewritten in fire. But that wasn't what left her trembling. What shook her was the quiet question rising in the silence. What now? Repatriation would begin soon. They were told to gather their things, pack, return, a long journey across the ocean, and then— what? Home? She opened her wooden chest slowly. Inside, a bar of soap wrapped in paper. A blanket, still faintly smelling of starch and cotton. A harmonica someone had gifted her after class, though she never learned to play it. She laid them out like relics, like stolen artifacts from a version of herself that hadn't existed before this camp. She considered leaving them behind. It felt wrong to bring American things into Japanese soil, but it felt even more wrong to abandon them, as though they hadn't changed her. The blanket had been wrapped around her shoulders the first night she cried without shame. The soap had given her back her skin. The harmonica had played when she sat on the edge of belief, staring at a garden she never expected to grow. She folded them carefully, not to hide, but to carry. Others packed in silence. Some threw things away, ripping pages from notebooks, burning letters in makeshift stoves. One woman scrubbed her hands raw, trying to erase the memory of softness. Another refused to speak, eyes hollowed by something deeper than fear. But the question hung over all of them, unspoken, like smoke that never cleared. Were we freer here than at home? It wasn't just a question of comfort. It was identity. In Japan, they would return not as heroes, but as shameful survivors, prisoners, women who had eaten enemy food, learned enemy words, touched enemy kindness. Their families might disown them. Their marriages, if any had been arranged, could be annulled. Their loyalty would be suspect, their silence expected. Here they were still prisoners, but they had laughed, they had grown gardens, they had danced, if only in their minds, across a dusty compound under the music of another world. The nurse touched the notebook the volunteer had given her. Its pages were half filled now, some English, some Japanese, some words she'd made up herself. She tucked it inside her suitcase like a lifeline. The train would come in 3 days. After that, a ship. And then, the unknown. The night before they left, she sat outside one last time, facing the garden. The shoots were taller now, green, stubborn things that didn't ask permission to grow. She whispered goodbye, not because she loved it here, but because it had changed her. And change, she now knew, could be a kind of freedom, too. The train groaned to a halt beneath a sky choked with ash. The nurse stepped down into a city she didn't recognize, not because it had changed beyond recognition, but because she had. Tokyo had once been familiar, a place of straight lines and tightly bound rules, where duty threaded through every street like electricity through wire. Now it lay shattered. Blocks of stone and steel caved in on themselves. Smoke still rose from the belly of the city, slow and persistent, like grief that refused to dissipate. She walked with a single suitcase in her hand and the wind pressing ash into her coat. The street names were the same, but the houses were ghosts. Her family's home had vanished, burned clean to the foundation. No roof, no walls, just a charred wooden beam sticking from the ground like a broken finger pointing nowhere. She did not cry. Not then. She simply stood in the middle of the street, the quiet scream of absence vibrating in her bones. She had prepared herself for shame, for suspicion, for faces that would turn away. But she hadn't prepared for no one. Her entire world had disappeared, and yet she had come back carrying things. A notebook, a bar of soap, a blanket, and one letter, folded carefully in the inside pocket of her coat. The letter was never sent. She'd written it in Texas, under a ceiling fan and the buzz of a single light bulb. In it, she described stew, a harmonica, the taste of bacon, and one sentence she could never erase. "They don't treat me like an enemy. They call me ma'am." She pressed the folded paper to her chest. It was warm from her body. She knew she would never deliver it, not now. But it had lived with her, crossing ocean and silence and time. A record of a truth too strange to speak aloud. She found work at a hospital, quiet hours, folded linens, helping others relearn how to breathe. She said little of the war, even less of the camp. Her English faded from her tongue but stayed in her mind, especially one word, freedom. It echoed, not in what she had seen since returning, but in the contrast of what she had lived through. Sometimes, walking home, she'd pass by children playing in alleyways, using scrap metal as toys, their laughter piercing through the gray. And in those moments, she remembered the dance, the fiddle, the fence, and a cowboy's voice in the warm Texas dusk, saying with casual certainty, "She's not a captive to me." That sentence had been the undoing, and the rebirth. She had not understood it then, but now, standing in a country that asked her to be silent, to be ashamed, to erase what had happened, she clung to that voice. Because it hadn't been about permission, it had been about recognition. That even when history chained her, even when her own people might cast her out, someone had looked at her and seen something more than uniform or enemy. They had seen a person. And so she walked. Through rubble, through memory, through the fragments of a life she would never fully reclaim. But she walked as someone no longer bound by only what she had lost. She carried what she had found, dignity, fragility, and the bitter, beautiful truth that the soul can bloom even in the most unlikely soil. She had gone to war, a daughter of empire. She returned a woman of her own making, and she was not a captive, not anymore. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Where are you watching from? We'd love to connect with you.